Alright, hello everybody, greetings from a tiny little room in the big house in Mosul, Iraq. I apologize for being a little slow, but with all my running around, I've actually gotten sick, which just makes things fantastic. Okay, so today we are looking at the Chalcolithic period. I hope you guys got through the last of the Neolithic, and I will be moving on to EB next class. Now, the Chalcolithic is this later period. If you remember back to the beginning of class when I talked about the 3-age system, the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, well, the Chalcolithic was something that was sort of slipped in afterwards, and we realized that this was a period of experimentation, if you will, where they were still using stone tools to make a lot of their tools and weapons, but we really start to see evidence of using copper as well, smelting copper. But that's just the simplest explanation. What you're looking at in this period too is a period of major social innovations, building on everything that has been coming through the previous periods. This is where we really start to move into larger and larger settlements. In the Mesopotamian world, we get the first cities that we're talking, hundreds of hectares in size, and in the Levant, well, they call them big cities in the Levantine world, but they're more around like 20, 30 hectares. The scale is totally different between the two regions. But the big thing is it's a lot of social innovation, people living to learn together, people developing new vocations other than farming. This is where we see the birth of real long distance trade, probably warfare, metallurgy, of course, and pottery becoming something that is more of a professional thing rather than being just a household industry. So in the Northern Levant, in Northern Levantine terminology, the Chalcolithic begins with this cultural assemblage we call the Halaf culture, which begins at circa 6,000 and lasts for about 600 years. It overlaps somewhat with the end of that dark phase burnishware that we talked about in last class. But the thing about this is that the culture is not an indigenous development, but rather something that comes from the outside, specifically northern Mesopotamia. And this is one of the things that you're going to see for the Chalcolithic period, is that northern Mesopotamia, or the northern Levant world is tied more into the Mesopotamian world than it is to the southern Levant. So this cultural assemblage is, for the most part, known for its highly distinguishable, very easy to spot due to its very sort of distinctive and really quite attractive pottery. There's also certain types of architecture which is often associated with this culture, tholoi houses, that we'll get into that little mess in a little bit. It's a very very simple sort of farming culture. It's only found within the dry zone area of northern Mesopotamia and the Levantine world, so in that area that gets between, a bare minimum of 300 millimeters of rain per year that you can grow without having to do anything like irrigation. In many respects, the Halaf is kind of a continuation of the previous Hasuna culture that I can't really get into because it's beyond the scope of this, and it's a Mesopotamian only thing. The main thing is the innovations that we see between the Hasuna and the Halaf are cultural. Now, this gives you a good idea of that arc of that 300 millimeter rain zone. We found in this arc across the Near East, and agriculture is carried out without any sort of large-scale irrigation works, if you will. Now, this map that you see here is kind of old, and we've been finding Halaf sites all the way up into Lake Ormia, which I think. So, Lake Ormia is here, Lake Van. So, hello, Lake Ormia, and then also up here in the Caucasus. So its distribution is huge, and this is the first major distribution of a culture in the Near East. Now, the horizon is defined by this incredible similarity in the pottery and its motifs. When you think of that giant map, essentially, the way it was explained to me when I was a student is that you could take a sherd from the site of Tel Halaf or Arbacia, which is actually about a kilometer from where I am, and we're going to be actually popping over to see it. Sorry, Tel Halaf is in northern Syria. Arbacia is the one that's right near me. So you'd be able to pick one up from northern Syria and drop it in Arbacia, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. It's almost like, the same potters were making these things. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but it looks like, maybe either the same workshops, or more probably, it's a matter of better communication of ideas across a large zone. There's also a lot of similarities in small objects, statuaries and figurines and whatnot that cover an area of about 550 kilometers. So the pottery now it's a specialized production. People are spending a hell of a lot of time on painting these things. And they're communicating these ideas, the concepts of arts, preferred styles, etc. Over this increasingly large distance. Now, when we look at the distribution of this culture, we as archaeologists, try very hard to explain how, in such an early period, we can have this large and uniform distribution of a culture. It's been long believed that such uniformity, to have this sort of uniformity, there would have been significant interaction amongst the communities. It's been suggested that with the Halaf, we have a shift in social organization. It's believed that we were moving from what before used to be called a tribal society of the previous periods to more of a chieftain one, and this is one that will last probably well into the early Bronze Age in the Levantine world. This might explain the greater social organization and spread of ideas over such a long distance, but honestly, we're kind of grasping at straws here. Now, the sites that we're just going to talk about when it comes to the Vermont and the Halaf, there's really only two. I put Hama on there just because I will make reference to it, just so you know where it is, but there's two, Tel Kurdu and Domus Tepe. Kurdu is in the Imuk Valley, not too far from where we at U of T dug, and I dug there back in, holy crap, 98. And Domus Tepe is sort of a sister site up in the north, in the Marash Plain. So the Halaf culture got its name from the site of Tel Halaf in northern Syria at the headwaters of the Habur River Basin, sort of on the present Turkish-Syrian border, or the old Turkish-Syrian border, thanks to what's happening in the region right now. The Turkish border has moved a lot south, but that's another story. So this is the type site. But it's where the culture was first identified. But the Halaf levels really aren't that substantial. The majority of it belong to the Iron Age, and when we come to the Iron Age, we'll come back to the site because it's a pretty important and pretty cool site. The Halaf culture is, of course, best known for the excavations of Arbacia here in Mosul, excavated by Sir Max Mallowan in the 1930s. Max Mallowan is one of these big names in early British archaeology, and if you know your literature at all, it's the husband of Christie. Last year when I was here, we basically spent an hour trying to find the site so I could have some good photos for class, but we couldn't find it, but we actually think we finally have it now. The mound is supposed to be about 125 meters in diameter and has 8 meters of Halaf deposits, and there's just this general uniformity in the Halaf pottery. And the material at Arbacia is really some of the finest examples of the wares, and also produced some of the most substantial architecture as well. And so it's often been suggested that Arbacia might have been a specialized artisans' village, producing a lot of fine pottery specimens as well as other finds like steatite pendants, stone discs, etc., etc. But when we actually got to doing analysis on a lot of the pottery from the Halaf, from all over the bloody place, we realized that Halaf pottery is all made at each individual site. We thought that originally that maybe Arpachia was, there was a handful of sites that were creating this Halaf pottery, and then it was being spread out everywhere. But this doesn't seem to be the case. It's the ideas that are being spread. Now, the settlements often have cobbled streets, both rectangular, rectilinear, and also circular architecture, which have been inappropriately dubbed tholoi, based on this sort of Mycenaean tomb architecture that belongs to the Bronze Age of Greece, and it was discovered not too long before the Halaf culture was, and unfortunately they sort of misapplied the term, if you will. The size of these circular buildings vary greatly. Average ones, small ones, go to 3 to 4 meters, but the ones at Arpachia are 7 to 9 meters. The walls usually have stone foundations and then have mud brick or pisé superstructure, and are believed to have been topped with wood or twigs, forming sort of a beehive shape. Often, but not always, there was this rectangular annex that was added to the front of the structure, which is what gives it sort of that keyhole shape. Old school keyhole, I should say. Probably not what you would see today. Originally, Malone, when he was finding them, he thought the tholoi were used as some sort of religious functions. This was due to the fact that he was finding all these cult figures in the structures rather than in the vicinity of the structures. But we've just come to realize that no, they're just everyday houses. Now, these tholoi have been found in a large geographic area across the upper Euphrates, near Carchemish, to the Hammam Basin, which is just a little bit north of where I am. But as I said earlier, the rectangular architecture really sort of prevails. You wouldn't get to know that from looking at the way people talk about it, but it actually is. At Arpachia, we have a ton of vessels that are found in situ because the uppermost level was destroyed in a big fire, and so we have a lot of pottery, jewelry, figurines, amulets, just amazing stuff that comes from the site. There is, of course, the question of why so much wealth was concentrated at this one site, especially in one particular building. God, I'm sorry, that sounds horrible. Suggestions have varied from communal storage to a treasure room of a local chieftain. We can't really say for sure. So getting to the pottery itself, like I said, these are the most striking feature of this culture. It's handmade, but the clay itself is highly levigated, which means they basically wash the clay with a lot of water to get all the impurities, the stones, the twigs, the crap. Like if you dig clay out of a river basin or riverside, you're gonna have a lot of garbage in there, and that stuff's gonna make your pottery be less fine, won't fire properly, will be harder to sort of shape. And so what you do is you levigate it, as we call it, which is basically sticking it in a basin with water and mixing it up and letting the fine clay particles float or sink to the bottom. Sorry, the heavier clay particles sink to the bottom. The lighter clay particles will come to the top, and you basically can scoop out the lighter clay stuff to make really fine pottery. And so they clearly they knew the process, and they were spending a lot of time doing this. So it's hand formed, if you will, and it's fired in a 2-chamber kiln, which is another important thing because it suggests that they understand the use of oxygen in the firing process to give colors. Like when you look at these things, we call them painted, but it's not really paint. It's actually like the finest levigated clay, and then you're playing with the amount of oxygen in the kiln to form these colors. It's just absolutely amazing, really, when you think about it. Some of the vessels in shape of humans, also animals. And petrographic and chemical analysis shows that while some of the pottery was widely traded, a lot of it was made locally. We have found evidence of stuff from Arpachia that was found at Halaf and even Tel Brak on the Habor, and stuff that was made in the Euphrates was actually found in Arpachia. So where there is some amount of pottery that's moving around, that's perhaps where the ideas are being, how the ideas are being communicated. The majority of stuff is still made locally, but this is the first time that we see pottery being really sort of traded on a wide scale like that. Yeah, furthermore, when you look at the settlement patterns, there's a recurring pattern of smaller sites surrounding larger settlements, which fits with our idea of sort of a ranked chiefdom. Somebody would be sitting in, the chief, the big man, would be sitting in the big site, and more people would be out of the food production service in the big sites, and to survive, you end up having to bring smaller settlements, satellite settlements, around you into food production to feed the people in the big city. There's a sort of a strong evolution that happens over time with the ceramics, going from simple to more complex, and then by the end of it, becomes simple again near the tail end. And when we move into the sorry about that, somebody wanted to know where the hell I was, and so they tracked me down. So yeah, we can see this evolution in ceramics going from simple to more complex, down to simple again. In the following period, the Ubaid ceramics tend to be more simple. And that's seen in the ceramics, in their sort of, well, the shapes are fairly common throughout. It's more the decoration that they do. And then you see the same thing with their figurines as well. So looking at some of the sites themselves, like I said, we have something like Halaf and Arbachia, which are well, Halaf is a small site. Arbachia is a bigger one, and there's the smaller satellite sites around. But they, most of the sites are 1 to 2 hectares in size, and this ceramic site, even the smaller ones. But what's been uncovered in the last few decades is we have a couple of these comparatively large ones. Like I said, they're usually sitting around 1 to 2 hectares, and then we have these monsters at 18 to 20 hectares in size, which have been dubbed Halaf super sites. I don't really like the name, but what can you do? 2 main ones on the Levant are Tel Kordu in the Amuk and Domus Tepe in the Marash Plain. So, like I said, Tel Kordu's in the Amuk, and actually, well, they stopped excavations about 15 years ago, but they just started back this summer, so we'll be getting a lot more information from it. But you can see that it's all rectilinear architecture. No circular architecture has been found at all. The ceramics at Kordu are unmistakably Halaf, but there is also this sort of local flair to them, not as uniform as we would see in sort of the heartland of Mesopotamia. There are some identical copies, but the majority are what we sort of call Halaf-related, in little quotation marks, that have actually a lot of local Levantine parallels. Interestingly enough, the best parallels come from Ras Shamra and the Rouge Basin, and also the quake in Syria, just about 100 kilometers to the east. More interesting, though, is Domus Tepe and its famed death pit. Between 1997 and 2003, this really weird structure or burial was excavated that they dubbed the death pit. The pit itself was about 3 meters in diameter and about 1.5 meters deep, filled with layers of disarticulated human and animal bones, broken pottery, and other artifacts. Whatever it was, you had like some sort of ceremony that took place at this site that probably went over a few weeks, had several phases, and they were basically throwing in dead bodies into this over and over again. What exactly is going on here, we don't really know, but it was perhaps that either it's been suggested that some sort of plague or something that hit, or more probably some sort of war, local fight that happened, and these are the prisoners that were slaughtered in sort of a victory parade, if you will, and thrown into the pit. There's lots of discussion on this thing because it's just so weird. But it's thankfully a unique discovery for the time period. So the late Neolithic and Chalcolithic in the northern Levant is tied into Mesopotamia. This is where we start to see a spread of a more uniform culture that comes out of Mesopotamia. Well, sorry, this is a bit of a misnomer because it's talking about Mesopotamia proper there. You have people that are coming out of northern Mesopotamia moving into the marginal zones that will form the Halaf. Now, the key thing is some sort of change in social organization is happening in this period, probably to a move to a chieftain society, and it leads to a lot more interregional interaction, much more than we had seen in previous periods. Basically, we're looking at sort of a spread of an idea, a way of life, a way of this idea of organizing yourself around a big man, or even just a new sort of form of organizing your economy. We can't really say for sure. In some case, it does probably represent the movements of people, but it's not as big as our old cultural historical school would have liked to portray it with, all these people coming out of northern Mesopotamia moving into the Levantine world. Now, following the Halaf is this Ubaid culture, which is a major culture that starts in southern Mesopotamia about the same time as the Halaf, and then it'll eventually sort of spread north and replace the Halaf, not only in northern Mesopotamia, but all over, including the Levantine world. Do I have it here? Yeah, so interesting thing is Ubaid 0, where it really sort of starts. I can't really get into that. But it's really not until, come on, you can go back. No, it won't let me go back. Ubaid 3 that it really starts to spread, and we find it in the Levantine world. Now, the ceramics vary a lot from buff, so just plain pink wares, with monochrome painting, with rectilinear patterns or grids or trials or triangles or zigzags and stuff like that. And then it'll eventually evolve into sort of a dark purplish paint with sort of a metallic luster. Again, it's sort of a technological thing. And you have designs being done in the negative. And then, kind of like what we saw at the Halaf, eventually the final form will just be a more simple form of decoration. So the Ubaid 3 period is when the culture spreads throughout most of Mesopotamia. So it starts down here in the south, then starts to spread north. It replaces the Halaf culture and goes out into the Levantine world, as you can see there. Now, the Ubaid is weird, to say the least. And this is where we're looking at maybe more than just the spread by idea, but we're looking at more people. So, can't really get into it much, but like the Mesopotamian world, especially the early Mesopotamian world, in Iraq proper, it's devoid of resources. And so very early on, they learned to make use of the only thing they had available to them, which was clay. And so where up in the north we have sickles that are made with these stone tools, or in the Levantine world, remember our little denticulated sickles? Well, they don't have those stone tools, or the stone to make the tools, and so they make things out of clay. So you're looking at on the left here, this is a great example from the Baghdad Museum I just took the other day, of a couple of sickles made out of clay. And you just form it till you have a nice sharp edge, and then you let it bake out in the sun. And you use that to harvest your wheat. There's also a clay axe that you see down there on the bottom right-hand side. And then we also find tons of these weird little things that nobody is entirely, well, I think we have a pretty good idea what these things were. We call them bent nails. And we find them in all these various shapes, either straight up, slightly bent, totally bent and melted. And the idea behind this is that what we're probably looking at is sort of an ancient thermometer for their pottery kilns, in that they don't have a way to tell whether the clay is hot or the oven is hot enough to to insert their pottery. So you stick this in there, and if it's too hot, it'll start to melt and vitrify and collapse. If it's if it's not hot enough, well, basically nothing will happen to it. And then if it's the right temperature, it'll just bend a little bit and go hard. And that is basically what you're looking at there. Now, with the Ubaid, and can't really get into it because again, that's a whole other, well, it's the Mesopotamian class. We have the explosion of large monumental temples. Temples now become the focus of societies, and they are done on a grand scale, and they're investing tons of energy and money into the architecture of these things, and you can see them sort of evolve over time into these simple little two-room niche things to larger, more elaborate stuff. This is what's known as the Eridu temple sequence. And look, these things, so we see this amazing complex architecture for temples that emerges and becomes sort of the focus of settlements. Some would suggest that we have a change in the organization of the society and the economy again to something that they call a temple economy, where the priests in the temples are the ones who direct society for what they grow, how much they grow. They have to give tithes. They collect the surplus, and that they will give it out in hard times, or they'll give it out to sow in the next crop cycle. The temple takes control over everything, and this is just sort of the assumption. Well, okay, the textual data seems to suggest something like that, but I think many of us believe that it's a part of a larger economy, not the dominant form of the economy. But as this culture starts to spread, we see it emulated in other societies, particularly in Anatolia. Now, we don't have it in the Levant, but unfortunately that's because it's really sort of poorly represented. In contrast to the Law period, scholars disagree on the nature of Ubaid society. Some, like I said, would argue that they're this largely egalitarian society, with each household producing most of the goods needed for a few people, and if any exempted from the task with few, if any, exempted from the task of subsistence production. In this view, sort of the temples and their associates had very little authority outside the realm of religious rituals and few or no economic privileges. But that is just plain wrong. You collect all these goods, all this food stuff into the temples run by one or two people. You're going to tell me that they're just going to not take advantage of it? No, they are totally. This is human nature at its best. They will always take an advantage of the material that they are given, especially in this case, given for free as part of a religious ritual. So we generally understand the Ubaid society had economic and social hierarchies. According to these scholars, religion served as sort of the base ideology for legitimizing the emerging differentiation amongst people, who could then command, or had the ability to command and commandeer labor and the products of others. Temples collected and stored the surplus grains, acting as a safety net against ever-present danger of crop failure or famine, and of course would be consumed by the people. Evidence held up to support this theory is discovered of just a ton of ceilings in the temples at sites all over the Near East. Often they're thrown out as evidence of the developing temple economies, but this is somewhat difficult to prove, considering that all the ceilings that were found in temples, well, basically they're not only found in temples, they're found all over the place. We find ceilings all over these Ubaid sites. Furthermore, the structures that we believe are used for storage don't seem to be associated with any temples. So if the temples are the ones who are collecting and storing grains, why don't we have large silos or something associated with them? We don't have it. That being said, this idea of temple-run economies through the debate has been given less and less credence, I should say, over the last decade or so, or that it's, like I said, not the only system operating in this period. It becomes really difficult to reconcile when we look at the subsequent Uruk period, which produces evidence pointing towards a more market-run economy, that everything was an egalitarian one in the preceding Ubaid society. However, when you look at the activities of the houses, the residences at different sites in all the different regions, there are a lot of marked similarities. Every Ubaid site has a range of artifacts used in food procurement, processing, cloth production, pottery making, chipped stone tools where they actually are making them. Despite the general similarities in the artifact inventories, there's obviously going to be regional differences, mainly because of the raw materials that they have access to. In the north, stone is used more for objects like tools, whereas the south was used for the same objects. But then we also have these clay sickles that are showing up in the Imuk, where we actually have stone. So it's, I don't know, we can't really explain it. A lot of it is a matter of resources and wealth distributions, but there is something else going on about traditions. Some scholars looking at sort of the apparent absence of wealth at a lot of these sites still want to say that these deficiencies point towards an egalitarian society, but they're forgetting about the giant pile of wealth that is the temple. And really, if you do a closer examination of the evidence, there is significant evidence for economic and social differentiation. The temples, like I said, they're built on platforms ranging from 1 to 10 meters in height. They have incredible decorative features. They have more elaborately decorated painted ceramics, although it have sort of a higher intrinsic value. It could be said that when we find these things being in the context of a temple, they're for the service and glory of the deity, but it can't be denied that the related personnel who are working in the temple enjoy the material benefits of these objects, because human nature. Oh, yeah, just sort of a side note as well about egalitarian. There's a site in Iran, Farrukhabad. This is getting way out of our thing, but they looked at the animal remains that were found at sites and at different houses, and the larger houses produced more bones and of larger animals, and smaller bones were of smaller animals and were of crappier cuts, showing that there is differentiation in the access to food supplies as well. All in all, just to say that we're really throwing out this bloody egalitarian society for the Ubaid. So how then do we describe the social organization of the Ubaid period? Well, the evidence doesn't really fit in the earlier models, and we're kind of sort of at a loss. It's been suggested that we're looking at what we call a tribute economy. Tribute economy is very similar to a chieftain society, if you will, where it's dependent on a significant degree of mobilization of tribute, the forms of goods and labor to produce them, from the producers to the political elite. In tribute economies, the primary producers, the Joe Schmoes who grow the food and make the craft products, usually have access to the basic needs to sustain themselves and means of production. And then portions of surplus food and utilitarian crafts or goods would be collected by the elites for their own needs, collected by coercion or by some intrinsic political position, who can really say. This surplus is then used to fund institutes of political control, like say a temple, sponsor long-distance trading expeditions, or acquire more sort of prestige goods, or more likely to buy the labor of others. So we don't really have a ton of Ubaid sites that have been excavated in the Levantine world, but what we can say is that they are really sort of locked more to the northern Levant. We don't have any evidence of Ubaid material. It's Ubaid-like stuff that is sort of popping up every once in a while in the southern Levant, but it's generally sort of isolated to the north. Because the north is, we'll see, historically more tied to the Mesopotamian world. Now, what emerges in the next period, in the last part of the Chalcolithic, is, once again, something that emerges out of the southern Mesopotamian world, building on what had been going through the Halaf and the Ubaid periods. Now, long-distance trade has been around since at least the Epipaleolithic, and continues to grow in size and scope over time, and I really wish I can't go back to that slide. But what you see in this Uruk period is, wait, can I do this? What you can see in the Uruk period, if you go back to that previous slide that I unfortunately can't go to, is that the Uruk world, basically early on, they stretch out of the southern Mesopotamian heartland where they are formed, and they reach up well out of the Mesopotamian world into the north, into Syria, into Turkey, all the way into the Caucasus, into Iran, and into the Levant. And they are setting up trading colonies where they're basically going out trading something. We kind of believe it's textiles, but we'll get back to that in a second, and funneling it back for the raw materials that you will need to feed these larger cities that are emerging in this time period. Now, the key thing with the Mesopotamian plain here is, it's flat. The only resources we have around here, it's kind of funny to think that I'm actually sitting here talking about that, is soil, dirt. Okay? They have extremely fertile soil all around. Palm trees, which are not great for doing a lot of things, and reeds. So they have a lot of land that they can bring under farming. And once they really sort of develop and get a full understanding of irrigation, they can bring huge swaths of land under cultivation to feed an enormous population that will then lead to the creation of a huge surplus to pull even more people out of food production to create more things. So this little map here that you're seeing is Uruk, the main city of Uruk, and the amount of land that could be reached within, the green is the amount of land that would be necessary to sustain the population of the city of Uruk, the site, the little dots. All those little dots represent towns and villages, Uruk being the largest one at about 200 hectares at this point. 200 hectares! Of course, I'm sitting in a 750 hectare site, but anyways. What this is really showing you is that even though you have an immense population, within 1 hour of walking from your town, you have a ton of land that can be brought under cultivation. In this case here, 72,000 hectares of land that's needed to sustain the populations of all these little towns. Then there's 280,000 hectares of land that's available, almost 4 times the amount that's necessary for food production. So it means that you're pulling an incredible amount of people out of food. And this is where we have an explosion of secondary products for trade. We have the art that is emerging in this period is mind-boggling. The architecture is crazy. But there's also a lot of stuff that we don't know, well, it's archaeologically invisible and is gone, and we think that a lot of what's going on too is textile production, carpets, cloth and whatnot. And you have this large population of women who are being pulled out of doing a lot of the home food production, and they are the ones who are making almost like a mini industrial or very early industrial revolution, where they are just working in large rooms, like early factories, if you will, and just pumping out textiles and textiles and textiles that then people are taking across the Near Eastern world and trading for raw materials that they need, that are then brought back down and reworked into other great works of art. So it's like we have incredible stuff that's found made of metals, made of lapis lazuli, made of stone and well, wood and gold and some stuff like that. And you have to keep in mind that none of that is found locally. They have to move way out to be able to do it. But you have this incredible artistry of people doing it in Uruk, in Sumer. And then the architecture, of course, is on a whole other scale. Massive, these giant platforms and a temple built on top of it, and then they basically keep building up. This will eventually become sort of the step pyramid of the ziggurats, if you will, and then the interior decoration that you can see there. These are all sort of clay cones that are pressed into the clay columns to form these intricate designs. The pottery is, well, interestingly in that it's all plain, simply made because it's all being done sort of on an industrial scale, if you will. And one of the ironic things is that the most common, or at least the most easily identifiable and common form of pottery for the Uruk period are these things here that we call bevel bowls, that we believe they are used for giving out weighted rations of food, and it shows up a lot in Sumerian, or this Uruk period art. And you also see the word for the symbol for the word ku, to eat, is the symbol of a face and somebody holding up one of these bowls. And we can identify places where the Uruk people settled based on this discovery of these bevel rim bowls, which are really crappily made. There's no reason why anybody would try to reproduce these locally, because it's basically they take a sheet of clay, dig a hole in the ground, push the clay into the ground, and then use a knife to cut around the top to form that beveled rim, and they pull it out and fire it. And we find them in the hundreds. They're all stacked up in rooms when we find them. And so the idea is that we have colonies of people from the south who move up into the north, and they're there to basically interact with the locals and trade with them, usually their textiles or other sort of finished goods, and funnel these things back down to southern Mesopotamia for further processing and local consumption and sending it out again, like a sort of a mini first industrial revolution, at least in theory. The extent of contact with the Levantine world is hotly debated. We have limited evidence for it in places like the Amuk, where there's a handful of bevel rim bowls that have been found, but not a lot. Hama is one of the other places that produces a good number of them down on the Orontes, but we don't find it in the south at all. But we also have to keep in mind that it also represents a period of great sort of technological innovations. Wheeled carts are probably emerging at this point. Sailboats and barges, fast wheels for ceramics. There's all these technical innovations that go along with this stuff. The pottery, like I said, the pottery is very plain. There's nothing very fancy about it, but that's because it's all done on a fast wheel at an industrial scale. Yeah, like I said, there's weak evidence for it at Judea and the Amuk, more at Hama, and though there's also, suggestions of it at Ugarit, but not a lot. It's very poorly published. But what it again sort of represents is a major technical watershed that will set the stage for the later developments that we'll see in the early Bronze 1. So now we'll turn to the southern Levant, if you will. Now, previously we had the Yarmoukyan and the Wadi Raba cultures in the area. Yarmoukyan was believed to have been sort of this indigenous culture that evolved out of the PPN. And the Wadi Raba, well, it's not as clear cut. There's some evidence that point to some sort of northern connection, suggesting that we might have had an infiltration of people from around the Byblos area down into Palestine. As we move into the Chalcolithic, we start to have more and more data. It's been an area of extreme interest over the last few decades, and actually one of U of T's professors in Anthro, Ted Banning, who I mentioned earlier in other classes, has played a significant role in helping to clarify the period. Generally, we have a number of regional groups based on their sort of tight geographic regions, but one culture is particularly best known for the region called the Chasulian, which dates from roughly 4800 to 3600. But evidence is slowly emerging that we can probably push it back to about 5100. Now, so like I said, this is the Chalcolithic period, and we really don't see the the widespread use of copper metal, and especially in the southern Levant. But we do see other sort of important technological, economic, and social changes that are happening in this period. Pyrotechnology, so the advances in pottery making, the firing that they do to it, stuff that allowed what was happening in Mesopotamia to happen. Now it's spread, and uh, and this technology, advanced technology, is really sort of changing a lot of the pottery in the Levantine world as well. We have changes in settlement patterns, storage facilities, and a lot of changes in the art, if you will, to the period. The distribution of Chalcolithic sites across sorry. Yeah, there we go. The distribution of Chalcolithic sites in the southern Levant are significantly different from the preceding periods. We have a larger number of sites that are forming clusters. It's again sort of suggesting that we have a change in social structure, which makes sense because we're seeing that across the north and the Mesopotamian world as well. We see the growth of larger and larger communities. They tend to be clustered on these wadi, dry riverbed banks, but also in areas that were uninhabited in the Neolithic period. Oddly enough, they're found in sort of the peripheral semi-arid regions, not really the best regions for agriculture. And the other thing you have to keep in mind is these wadis don't flow all the time, but only in sort of the winter. And they got around this problem by carving out pools in the riverbeds to collect water and make it available for simple irrigation basically all year round. But for the most part, they've had a very sort of varied subsistence pattern, predominantly herding and simple horticulture. Now, olives are really sort of extensively being cultivated for the first time, and we start to see actually evidence for the exploitation, for their exploitation and the production of olive oil for the first time. And also we see the first evidence for the domestication of the grapes. Olives and grapes will form sort of like a historical, historically play an important role in the economy of the southern Levant forever, even today. Now, the site clusters appear to form some sort of hierarchy, with many of the sites being, really small, but at least one large site. So it suggested that, quite safely, that we're probably looking at a chieftain society similar to our Halaf stuff. We can see a series of regions for the southern Levant which produce these Chalcolithic sites: the Negev, the Judean Desert, the Jordan Valley, the Mediterranean zone, central Palestine. While sort of the central Palestine, oddly, shows very little evidence for habitation in this period. This is a really strange development, because this is really sort of the best climatic and agricultural territory, and nobody's living there. We're kind of at a loss to explain that. It might have something to do with a change in subsistence patterns for the period, but it doesn't totally make sense, as you can easily pursue the same, wheat, olives, and grapes there. There's something major that we are missing here, but the data hasn't clicked yet. By far the greatest concentration of sites are found in the Jordan Valley, with the site of Tel Rasul being the dominant center. Oddly enough, Jericho, which had played such an important site in all the previous periods, appears to be abandoned at this point. So the sites you need to know: Tel Rasul, Ein Gedi, and Bir Safadi. Only a few sites have been excavated with large enough exposure to give us an idea of the layout of the site, and Rasul is the only one to really sort of produce public architecture, with the exception of Ein Gedi, which is a whole other weird thing that we'll get to in a little bit. There appears to be some sort of degree of town planning, forming these sort of dense but unfortified sites. They were typically houses were typically this broad room type house, meaning that they were long and rectangular, about 3.5 by 12 meters in length, and with either a single room entered through the door in the middle of one of the long sides, or with a second smaller room partitioned off at one end, or even occasionally both ends of the main room. Rasul has many houses with associated fenced yards and produced small silos and animal pens arranged in clusters of small farm compounds. And they're arranged around streets and dead-end alleys all throughout the site. Another site, Ain al-Hariri, which is found in the Golan, is really similar, just with a slightly different arrangement. Rather than having clusters of farm compounds, we have a series of broad room houses that are bigger, 6 by 50 meters in length, and they're sort of linked together in a chain. Almost, linked end to end in chains, instead of forming parallel rows. So the site of Rasul is rather unimpressive when you sort of get there. It's a series of low mounds in the Jordan Valley, covered an area of about 20 hectares. Most of it was made up of densely packed multi-room houses, usually rectangular, but you also have some weird sort of trapezoidal shape, basically meant to fit into whatever space was available. Like I said, there's tons of sort of storage containers around them, and there's evidence of wall paintings on some of the buildings. One of the more famous discoveries is this thing here, this painted wall plaster with black and red paint of what's been known as the Star of Rasul. There's been much written about that, but most of it's really not important and kind of nonsensy. Now, in the Beersheba Valley, we have another series of small clusters of settlements that are found sort of on the edges of the valley. Unlike Rasul, the dwellings in the Beersheba are actually carved into the soft ground, forming sort of artificial caves. The best comes from the site of Bir Safadi. The earliest of these subterranean dwellings is basically a large single room, 7 by 3 meters, dug into the sides of hills with an inclined entrance, kind of like little hobbit houses. But these proved to be unstable, so later dwellings were dug as a series of small oval-shaped rooms. You basically have a vertical shaft that would be cut down, and then they would dig these oval-shaped rooms off of the sides of them. In the final phase of occupation, they began to build rectilinear structures on the surface. These structures themselves, people thought originally they were beginning with tombs, but you can see that there's a lot of domestic and industrial stuff going on in them. And plus there was a lack of dead bodies, so that kind of really gave you a hint that we are not dealing with tombs. So some of the underground settlements produced evidence of being workshops. Ivory carving was really quite advanced at Bir Safadi, and we have a number of statuettes that were found at the site, and also this, we assume, ceremonial sickle carved out of ivory, and then a number of other sort of small, beautiful pieces. Ain Gedi. Oh, so much is written about this site. It's located on this terrace that's overlooking the spring at Ain Gedi on the west side of the Dead Sea. It's a Chalcolithic sanctuary, the best preserved religious complex for the time period. Now, the Ain Gedi spring is just absolutely beautiful. It's spectacular. You can see some of the photos. But then the terrace above where the temple is found is, well, dry, desolate, really not a place that you'd want to sort of. There you go. You can sort of get a view. It's like it's overlooking some good agricultural territory, if you will, but the temple itself is pretty basic. So it consists of the site consists of 2 buildings, a temple that's about 20 meters in length and 4 meters wide, and then a smaller structure, perhaps the house of the officiant priest that's found there. The houses are these broad room houses that I mentioned earlier. And the buildings are linked with an enclosure wall that created this large courtyard in front. You had benches in the buildings that you can see here. The courtyard okay, so this is the gate that allowed entrance into the courtyard. There's actually 2 gates. The main one at the south side, which had room lined with benches on the side of it, and then a smaller gate that led to the sanctuary, would lead from the sanctuary down to the spring itself. In the center, there's this large Circular structure was believed to be like maybe a basin for holding water, so it would go down to the spring, drag water up, and it'd be used for ablutions or something like that. Temple itself was a typical broad room plan structure, like I said, 5 by 20 meters, similar to what was found at Rasoul, a single entrance on the south wall. Opposite stood sort of a horseshoe-shaped installation with a polished standing stone, around which they found a number of pits with ashes that had animal bones and pottery fragments in it. So they would have, these pits would have been used for depositing the remnants from whatever ritual was going on there at the time. Benches flanked the podium on the wall on each side of the door. I showed you that earlier. And there was also small pits dug into the floor near each short wall that were also filled with ashes, burnt bones, and pottery fragments. Clearly there was a lot of cultic activity going on here, and it probably changed a little over time. The thing about this thing is that it's kind of in the middle of freaking nowhere. Exactly who this, the temple was serving is a big question. All of our other temples have been in the center of towns, whereas there's nothing. There's no nearby village. And so there's two possibilities. First, of course, if we don't know what it is, they must be nomads, and the idea is that it served the nomadic pastoralists of the Judean desert. They would come there every once in a while and have rituals and give to the temple or something like that. Or it was a regional sanctuary for some of the more distant communities like Rasoul. Whatever it was, the temple was abandoned at the end of the Chalcolithic. And like by abandoned, I mean like they sealed it up. They emptied all the objects, they sealed the door, they filled it in. Like it was ritually closed. They didn't just kind of walk away, which means that perhaps the cultic rite or whatever was going on in the site might have moved to another place. Now, often associated with the temple, but in really sort of a spurious manner, is a group of copper items known as the Nahal Mishmor hoard. And it's often held up as evidence for the sophistication of the copper, or the sophistication of the Chalcolithic copper industry in the southern Levant. And it's probably the most talked about group of metals in the southern Levant. Now, it was found in 1961. It's known as the Cave of Treasure. It's basically found in a cliff face in the Beersheba Valley overlooking the Judean desert, not too far from En-Gedi. Now, found inside were 436 copper objects that were sort of wrapped in a mat. And these things, there's no getting away from it. They're pretty amazing, and were remarkably well preserved thanks to the conditions of the region. Now, found in association with the hoard were some Chalcolithic sherds, which is why they dated to the Chalcolithic period, but also some stone tools, ivory, shell, and remarkably well-preserved textiles and other sort of perishable materials. Now, these pieces were all made through the lost wax technique. It is sort of a way of showing or talking about the technological development was at the time. So the lost wax technique is not a method that is lost. What it is basically is you want to make some sort of shape out of, some complex shape out of metal. What you do is you take wax and you form the statue. In this case here, you're looking at here the arrowheads. You can do like incredibly complex things. Shape it in wax, and then you wrap wet clay around the wax so that then the clay will sort of form a negative impression. And you bake the clay. The clay hardens, becomes basically indestructible, the wax melts away. And then you pour your molten metal into this clay mold to get basically a copy of what you had made out of wax. It's perhaps one of the most basic ways of making complex metal objects, still used today. If you actually Google or go on YouTube and do a search for lost wax techniques, you'll see a couple of good videos of people doing it in India with bronzes even today. Now, like I said, these things are really cool. They're so made with lost wax techniques, and it's copper with some arsenic. Now, this is what we call arsenical copper, and regular tin bronzes is by mixing copper and tin to make it a harder metal, and it'll hold its shape more, but it also will give it sort of a gold color. And arsenic does the same sort of thing. It makes the metal stronger than just plain copper, but not as strong as bronze would, but it also gives it more of sort of like a gold and silver sheen to it. Now, there is evidence of copper smelting that's going on in regions like such as Shikmin and copper working areas in the Wadi Fainan mines down in Jordan. And we have all, especially sites in the Wadi Fainan, we have tons of evidence that they are processing copper and smelting it and everything like that. So they have the technology to make these things here. The only problem is that there's no arsenic. Now, the arsenic, there's no arsenic that's found in any of the copper in the air in the region, and it's not found you can't find loose arsenic. Our best sources for copper with arsenic in it are basically Eastern Turkey, Eastern Anatolia, and the Caucasus. And if you think back to our dark-faced burnished ware and sort of the hint of maybe some connections to the burnished wares up in the Eastern Anatolia, people start to get a little carried away again. The objects themselves are absolute works of art, as you can see here, mainly staves or wands. Very similar to stuff that comes out of a site called Alashar in central Turkey, where we call them standards, and that comes out from the early Bronze Age. But this stuff is actually earlier. There's also things that we called crowns that were very ornamental, obviously. And the main thing is that the iconography that's being shown in this metalworking is that it's completely alien to the region. So you have alien iconography, alien ores. We suggest that these are imports brought in from Anatolia. But Shikmin, the site I mentioned before, which produces evidence of copper smelting, also produced one of the mace heads and a similar wand and scepter, suggesting that maybe they were being produced locally, perhaps using imported ores from Anatolia. Or another sort of limitedly explored idea is the idea of maybe an itinerant craftsman. So you have people coming from the north, small groups of metalworkers, tinkerers, if you will, who brought with them the ores, but also made them in their style there. Whatever their source, I have problems with that because the ore is heavy, and so to travel a long distance with the ore doesn't make a lot of sense. Although I guess they could sort of smelt it down to sort of bars and then re-smelt them into the shapes that they want afterwards. Whatever the source, these things are seen as cultic in nature based on the richness of the iconography. And given its relative closeness to Ein Gedi, many Syro-Palestinian archaeologists see a direct relationship between the Nahal Mishmar horde. Oh, sorry, it's the call to prayer. Let me pause. Okay, not done yet. I'll let you guys hear the call to prayer. I feel like the call to prayer is longer in Iraq than it is in Turkey. Sorry about that, guys. So yes, because of its relative, I use the term loosely, closeness to the Nahal Mishmar horde to Ein Gedi Temple, people really want to see it as perhaps being a horde, the horde as having come from the site, from the temple itself, and was hidden in the cave by priests of the temple, either at the end of the period when the temple was sort of abandoned and shut down, or maybe during a period of a time of stress, and then the people were perhaps killed during said stress, and the knowledge of it was lost. The link really is weak, although you wouldn't be able to tell that from the way people talk about it. But once again, we don't have any settlements associated with the find, so we're kind of at a loss to explain this insanely rich and amazing find that's basically in the middle of a bloody nowhere, in a cave in the middle of nowhere. So with the Chalcolithic culture, we have our first well-developed ceramic assemblage in the southern Levant. Sites along the Nahal Sheba, and you had pottery making technology that was also really quite advanced, being well fired, almost just sort of like a hard and clinky thing, and that's the result of having good power technological skills. They're able to fire it at a really high temperature that is like over 1500 degrees Celsius, which again is linked with the development of metallurgy and so on, because you need really high temperatures to be able to smelt copper. And so like even the coarse crappy wares are fired at this extremely high temperature, giving you this metallic clinky sound. So it's very, very weird. They don't use the fast wheel for throwing, but the vessels themselves are usually very thin. And what they do is they make the vessels probably from coiling, if you will. And then as they turn these things on a slow wheel, they have like a stone or something that they're basically scraping up and thinning the vessel out to a very thin shape. Again, so sort of showing the amount of effort that's being put into the construction of these vessels. There's a large variety of ceramic shapes, many of them apparently dealing with the storage of liquids. Again, perhaps pointing towards the importance of the growing importance of oil production in the area. But there's 3 vessels that in particular really sort of stand out, and that's chalices, these small bowls with tall bases, often sort of fenestration, so they've got like holes cut into them, and you can see here, into the bases. They kind of look like wine glasses or champagne glasses or something like that. Although some of these are ceramic, we also do have some fine examples made out of basalt. At least the basalt ones wouldn't be good for drinking, but they might have been for incense burners or something like that. But also coronets, which you're looking at here. These deep V-shaped cups with a pointed base, and we find these all over Rasul and all over the Jordan Valley and Beersheba Valley. And butter churns. We have a significant number of these weird shaped vessels that you see here, flat on one end, rounded on the other, with a spout on top, and each end had sort of lugs from which you would suspend them. With the idea is that you would have some sort of like A-frame made out of wood with ropes hanging from the top, and then you would tie it to the lugs. You pour milk into the spout or to the top of the vessel, and then you basically just shake it back and forth until it forms butter, or more specifically, it'll make clarified butter. It's known as ghee, if you will. And this is based on a lot of ethnographic comparisons. Butter obviously wouldn't be kept in this climate without any refrigeration, which is why we figure they made something like clarified butter. Essentially a butter oil without the solid fats, although they could have made butter and you ate it immediately. We have evidence of, we have depictions of these vessels in some statuary that you see here, the Lady of Gilat. This example, the Lady of Gilat in the Beersheba region, where we ironically don't find many examples of the pottery. And I will pause it again. Okay, I think we're done. So the Lady Gilat, it's found in the Beersheba, where we don't really find a lot of examples of these butter churns. She's a naked and somewhat stylized woman. It's often suggested that she's a goddess. She has very sort of pronounced genitalia. She has a coronet under her arm and a churn on her head. Storage of large amounts of grain appears to have been quite important. There are many sort of stone-lined pits or silos, and pottery that includes like these large storage vessels, pithoi as we call them, and we'll get to know that term very well, with sort of applied rope decoration, and sometimes with steps inside the pot, so that a smallish person or a child could climb inside, presumably to scoop out the last of the grain at the bottom of the vessel. Since probably a single one of these pithoi could probably hold enough grain to feed a family's annual needs, the large number of such pithoi typically found in Chalcolithic sites suggests that accumulation of surplus was really important to these societies. You know, those coronets as well, they have been chemically tested and they are probably being used for drinking wine. If you remember, one of the things that was found domesticated for the first time in the southern Levant at this time was grapes, and the coronets seem to suggest that wine was being drunk by people in the region at the time, and it's something that is sort of a first for the southern Levant, and it's probably why the wine industry will take off and then will play such an important role with Egypt in the following period, but we'll get to that next class. With the Chalcolithic, we also see a shift in burial practices with the development of cemeteries that are outside the settlements. However, the burial practices really sort of vary from region to region. We appear to have a cemetery associated with Sul at the site of Ademe, which is about 2 kilometers away. Now, there are 3 types of burials. Dolmens, which are kind of like little stone houses. Cists, those straight stone-lined pits, if you will, and tumulus burials, where they pile up stones on top of the body. But then the Negev also produces structures known as nawamis. These are weird things. They're round structures with stone foundations. They vary from 1 to 3.5 meters in diameter. They had a mud or mud brick superstructure, often contained more than 1 burial in them. All the bones were disarticulated, suggesting sort of a secondary burial that contained both adults and children. The variation in size is believed to represent the evidence of hierarchy in society, but who can really say for sure? In regions closer to the Mediterranean coast, we also have these ceramic ossuaries. They're bone boxes, often shaped like houses or decorated with animal figurines that were used for sort of secondary disposal of human bones. Interestingly enough, the ossuaries often have these sort of house that are often house-shaped. The door of the ossuaries is on the end rather than on one of the long walls that we would normally see with our broad-room houses. There is a spectacular and large group of ossuaries, and along with sort of tall ceramic incense burners and other cultic paraphernalia found at the site of Pagain in the remote sort of mountain regions of Galilee and northern Israel. And the ossuaries, do I have photos of them? Yeah, there we go. They're often decorated with human noses and sometimes eyes. Always sort of reminds me of, the little square robot that you see running around in Star Wars and the Death Star. Always reminds me of those little guys. So it's been argued that in the Negev, pastoralism became an important part of the Chalcolithic economy. You may recall that there was a lot of pastoral nomads already in the PPNC times, and there are more kinds of evidence for pastoralism in the Chalcolithic, although it's probably on a different sort of scale. The best evidence for this is seeing the secondary product revolution. That is, livestock are now being used for dairy production, i.e. our butter churns. It's possible that sheep have finally evolved woolliness that made them more valuable for textile production, seen with some of the cloth that's found in the Hot Mishmar. And ceramics produce preponderance of jars for storing liquids, as well as spouted jars for pouring out said liquids. All these suggest that we're developing beyond a simple subsistence of agriculture into a wider exploitation of their environment, which is what's needed for the following period in which we see the development of urbanism, and I'm putting that in quotes, for the southern Levant that will explode in the EB1. So summing up, if you